Good afternoon. I am Reverend Cooper from Community Presbyterian Church, and I'm bringing you the second installment of our book study on Lauren Winner's Mudhouse Sabbath. This week we're looking at chapters 2 and 3. So we will begin with chapter 2, which is called Kashrut, fitting food. She's talking about keeping kosher food laws that are observed by kosher Jews as set forth in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And to keep us focused on what the real intention is of such dietary laws, she writes that keeping kosher transforms eating from a mere nutritional necessity into an act of faithfulness. If you keep kosher, the protagonist of your meal is not you, it is God. I've underlined and highlighted this quote for you because I do think that in sharing with us the gems of spiritual practices from Judaic tradition, the intention is not to look at simply the hows of these spiritual disciplines. It's to look at the why. And I think she does a brilliant job of distilling that down into simple nuggets of golden wisdom for us. And this, for me, is that nugget as far as keeping kosher goes, that it's about making your meal focused on God. She then moves on in her chapter to talk about the difficulty in maintaining a kosher diet, which we don't need explained to us. I think we're all familiar with how hard it can be. And it goes so far as to requiring 2 sets of dishes so that your meat and your dairy don't touch, both in food preparation and in consumption, but also in any way that they're served. Her next segment segues into the way that Christians understand themselves to be freed from such laws. And she clarifies that there are some laws of the Old Testament that remain binding upon Christians. And she cites the 10 Commandments as an example of those bounds. But then she clarifies that we're free from civil and ceremonial codes. Dietary laws like those of Leviticus and Deuteronomy being the case in point. And then she moves on to talk about how God cares about what we eat, and that doesn't just mean we can take up the Atkins diet, for example, and think that we are honoring God in our dietary restrictions and observances. What she's saying is that arbitrary diets like Atkins and the like differ from kashrut, or keeping kosher, and that difference is God. She talks about that on page 21. And then she starts to talk about some inspiration that she found from authors who explored this idea of spiritual dieting, and she cites Robert Farrar Capon and Barbara Kingsolver as 2 authors that she upholds in her heart of hearts as glimmering lights in her path to enlightenment around this topic. And both have their own methods. Capon really sets forth a method of intentional eating, whereas Kingsolver puts forth her intention of seasonal eating. In this portion of chapter 2, though, there are 2 quotes I want to lift up that I think really capture something beautiful. She writes that food is a part of God's creation. A right relationship with food points us towards Him. And she's writing that in reference to Capon's writings in the Supper of the Lamb. And I think that, again, is another way in which she's working to not describe the how, but the why of observing this kind of spiritual discipline. And then Another why not how statement in reference to King Solver's seasonal diet is stated on page 24. She writes that King Solver's seasonal diet sacralizes not just food but time. So there are a couple of things that she's lifting up as she works through these two options. And then she closes out the chapter by talking about ways of eating with Christian attention and mentions fasting as an option, as well as making an allusion to the communion table, which is really interesting. So that's a brief summary of what she's saying. Let's shift now into some analysis. First and foremost, what she does is there's an implicit thesis that we talked about last week in our discussion of Sabbath that here she makes quite explicit. And it's that intention is the primary motivation for taking up a practice like kashrut or Sabbath, in that one would get into right relationship with these areas of life, in these modes of behavior, in order to help create right relationship with God. And she uses the term intention repetitively in chapter 2, and I think that this is a neat chapter for it to come out in, but I believe that it is present throughout the book, definitely as discussed around Sabbath. Second of all, I really appreciate her distinction between healthy and weight loss diets and kashrut, and that distinction being God. The intention is about more than self-discipline. It's about a spiritual discipline where we are intentionally oriented towards God. And so I think sometimes when we think about spiritual disciplines, it's very easy to interpret those as self-disciplines that require a certain level of abstention and rigor. And kashrut is a great example of that. And I think she's trying to disabuse us of those kinds of understandings, that we might really see the beauty in such a practice, not the regulatory nature that would require a strict lens on oneself and one's practices. She's trying to get us to see it a little bit more softly, if you will. I think that this chapter leaves us wanting in a lot of ways. It's a short book. She's not diving into the topic like a PhD dissertation might, would, could, or should. But there's a lot of things that she doesn't touch on when she's raising this issue of intentional spiritual eating. And clearly, there are lots of things that would need to be considered if you were going to take a deep dive into the issue. Eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating being all pertinent to that sort of extension of analysis. And then there's ethical forms of eating, veganism, vegetarianism, organic practices, hormone-free types of food. And I'm calling those all ethical forms of eating because I think that it goes towards not just being a conscientious consumer, like one might be if they were looking to purchase only organic products, but it also, or fair trade products for that matter, but it goes to the ethics behind how those things arrive in the grocery store, and what we're consuming and what that says about where we put our money. There are also extreme diets for weight loss, South Beach, intermittent fasting, which is now all the rage. And there are also lifestyle choices that are made around eating, and this is a huge topic of discussion. There's the whole farm to table movement, which becomes about so much more than just what you serve at your table. It's really the whole cycle from what goes in the ground to what comes up and how we get it back there. There's also convenience eating, which our nation is most guilty of, there being the fast food nation, as we are sometimes known to be. The new fad of meal delivery kits, since we are in a country where time is money and we don't really take up the slow eating methods that some other countries observe, namely Italy. It's really interesting to look at how we might extend this discussion to convenience eating. Lastly, Christian diets and abstentions. There are lots of abstentions that are observed in other denominations of Christianity. For example, abstentions during the season of Lent. And then there are Christian diets. Actually, there are some vineyard churches now where service will take place outside. There are churches that intentionally garden and they work to feed their membership from said garden. There's also the Daniel diet, which is borrowing from the Hebrew scriptures, but it became a Christian fad some time ago. And so with all of these kinds of things operating in the background around any discussion of eating and doing so intentionally, I think we have to be considerate of how sensitive this issue in fact is and can be for almost everybody in our contemporary culture. Our relationship with food is a relationship of vulnerability, and I think that if we're to access anything she's saying, part of that process would require recognition of that vulnerability. And you may not fall into any of the categories that I've listed that would require further analysis. Maybe you fall into several, but regardless, it is something that requires some, not just intention, but attention to what kind of relationship you've already got with food. And I would venture a guess that it's already pretty complicated. So then, what does disciplined eating with God as your intention look like, all things considered? What it already looks like as a vulnerable relationship and where you might want it to be. I think that another implication throughout Dr. Winter's book is that there is freedom of choice with these spiritual disciplines. She's not making outright prescriptions for us as Christians as to how we ought to proceed with each of these disciplines, saying this is what you should do. If you want X result, do Y, or vice versa. If you want Y result, do X. She's saying do what works for you and think about what your intentions might be and consider how you might adopt this in a way that would be meaningful for you and honor your relationship with God. And so I think for us, that would require some sort of examination of what a Christian ethic may be that matters to you personally and communally, and working to apply it. In some senses, we're already doing that as a church community. We work to feed our sheep as Christ commanded. As we work to feed the hungry, we have a command to feed the widows, to care for the widows, particularly by providing food. And we do that when we work to feed our elders who are unable to have visitors or routine family meals, and we bring food to them through things like Meals on Wheels or food delivery services to Manor Care, things that we've been doing particularly as of late. And then we certainly have the ethic of sharing the table, the Lord's table, when we observe communion. So there are some things that we're already doing as a church community to set our intentions around an eating ethic. And I think that this chapter can be best characterized as an invitation to consider ways that you may want to further observe stricter personal intentions. Do you want to take up an abstention during the next Lenten season? Do you want to consider fasting? Of course, by health guidelines. Are there intentional Christian dieting plans that you would want to research and possibly take up? And so, I do think that this is a very interesting chapter that I would encourage you to accept in the spirit of invitation. Dr. Winter's third chapter explains how the Jewish religion observes mourning in detail and suggests this as an invitation to explore how the Christian church might better provide its own form of ritual for those who mourn, because she states quite clearly in her introduction to this chapter that Christian churches do lack a ritual for mourning. And then she delves into the description of the calendar year that the Jewish ritual for mourning is built around. It begins with the burial, it moves into sitting Shiva, it then moves into re-entry into the synagogue, and then moves into a year's worth of 2 times daily prescribed prayer, finally marked by the bookend of the anniversary of a loved one's death. The details of which I'll leave to you, having presumably read this chapter already. And then some things that she lifts up that are unique about these rituals are, first and foremost, that present throughout each unit of time is the very clear mandate that those who grieve be surrounded by their community, so that there is not just a private process for grieving, and it's not exactly public, but it is quite communal in that those who mourn are really supported by their fellow believers, not just by a set of practices. There is a way in which those who are deep in grieving are surrounded by the loving kindness of their community. And then she also talks about the Kaddish, which is the prayer that the mourner is supposed to say throughout the year, and how unique it is that the actual contents of the prayer involve no mention of grief, but they're actually words of praise for God, and how, although the ritual makes space for mourning, this language is intentional so as to teach the heart that despite the grief, there is room for joy and room for praise when one's spirit is ready to see it again. And so I think that's really unique because it places hope within the mourning process in a way that may not make sense to the mourner at certain times, but certainly makes sense from a process-oriented perspective. So, moving into some analysis of the chapter, I think it's fair that she is in some sense criticizing the Christian church to say that we have rituals for burial, because I think we do have those, but we don't really have rituals for grieving, it seems to me, and particularly from my former call serving as pastor for member care, where I worked with a lot of bereaved church members, that grief gets left to counselors, and grief counselors, pastoral counselors, to doctors and psychiatrists, and it hasn't really found its way into the church outside of those burial rituals. Once we've laid someone to rest, we typically do kind of move on as a church community. And so I've already responded to some of our members about this chapter and some of the underlying theology that's going on here, because she's not the first theologian to comment on this, and certainly won't be the last, but her and colleagues who think like her, who are calling for and crying out for a Christian ritual for mourning, are working against a certain underlying theology in the Christian church that we have a mandate to constantly rejoice. Now, we are given new hope in Christ, the resurrection hope that death is ultimately defeated. So in that promise, we have a gift that is worthy of celebration. We've just celebrated that joy on Easter. We're reminded of that Easter hope. But unfortunately, that can get extended to a degree of almost irrationality, where some Christian ways of thinking find it to be ungrateful to express sadness or lamentation, to grieve, to mourn. And part of where that comes from is a theologically rich tradition of reliance on God's providence. And so in a Presbyterian denomination and others like it that laud God's providence and see that providence as a high point of our theology, there's a certain amount of trust that is required of believers to know and believe that God intends all things for our prosperity and for our goodness. And so even in the face of tragedy like death, for example, we are encouraged to find hope in God's plan. That being the providence, where God provides for all things, God's predestination, if you will, they're all roped in together, but I'm just calling it, for simplicity's sake, God's providence. That God has a plan to prosper us, and that's part of God's intention to provide for us well. And when we express unhappiness, we're showing distrust of those plans. And so that distrust is something that some theological interpreters would rail against and say that it is our job as Christians to take up the resurrection hope and to believe so deeply in God's plans for us that we would always find reasons to rejoice and set aside our despair, set aside our sadness, grief, and mourning. And so what you see are writers like Dr. Winner and similar thinkers who say that is sort of an unfair perspective, because although we take resurrection hope to be real and to be our ultimate and highest calling as believers, that doesn't then preclude us from feelings of sadness. And in fact, it can lead to even more problematic understandings of mental health, where depression and clinical diagnoses of that nature could possibly be seen as bad spirits that we would need to get rid of. And they're saying no, those are clinical diagnoses that are real. The experience of mourning and of grieving is real. They are recognized in the medical field, and we have a lot of catching up to do in the Christian church and in Christian theology to understand that these are spiritual places where lament resides, and we haven't figured out how to give voice to that incredibly well. Now, what scholars who think like Dr. Winter suggest is that the Hebrew scriptures know well how to give voice to lament. The Psalms of Lament are often cited as the best example of Hebrew expression of lamentation and mourning. But there are many other ways that that's present in Hebrew culture. There used to be professional mourners in Hebrew culture that would come to help ease the mourning process for those who would clam up, and they would come and they would cry professionally in services in order to help other folks to let the waterworks flow, understanding that there's healing power in tears. And so, Lauren Winter is working against that sort of happy Christian theology that hope should outweigh all of our other emotions, especially those negative emotions, and saying that it's important for us as Christians to balance our call to hope with our other negative emotions, that they would both have a voice. And the voice of lamentation needn't be muted. We ought to give voice to it. It doesn't render our hope in any way as moot or as less real. It's still quite valid, even if we have conflicting feelings. And so I'm reading her chapter again as an invitation to allow grief into our lives, especially into our spiritual lives. And that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to grieve. And it's particularly important that we do that with God. It's also important, and this is the part that I think that she's really hinting at, but is a deeper call to us as Christians to question what our practices are in this regard. She's calling us to be a community that supports our bereaved, and to move past this place where it's become a really private process. And so when I think about that, I start to think, this is another one of those shoulds, one of those things that you can put on the to-do list to say, this is what you ought to do to be a better Christian, is to be a better neighbor to those who are grieving, to support those who are mourning, and that there's more that I can do to be a better Christian, to be more of the community of God for that person, and that somehow I'm not good enough if I'm not doing that. And I'm not sure that's the spirit within which she's suggesting it. I think that is a way in which we as folks who like to create to-do lists might receive it. Is that somehow this is another Emily Postism of what we should do to be polite and good Christians. And I think really what she's asking us to do is to just be aware of how we aren't being a community for those who are bereaved, creating space in our community for those who are bereaved to feel welcomed, or supported throughout their grieving process. And so, as she's done in all of her previous chapters, she's not set any prescriptions for us about how we ought to proceed. This isn't an Emily Postism, but it's an invitation to think about the possibilities that we as the Christian church, and in our particular situation as Community Presbyterian Church, practices our Christian nurture, how we might take up the ethic of a communal grieving ritual, how we might support those who are bereaved. And so I think instead of taking this as another set of to-dos, another thing to put on your to-do list, this is really just an invitation to think more broadly about ways in which mourning can be a spiritual practice, and to think more openly about how we observe that personally, privately, and then communally and publicly. And so it's really a good chapter to get you thinking. I am interested to hear what your thoughts are in response. And so please do feel free to communicate with me as you continue your reading. Next week we will cover chapters 4 and 5. I look forward to analyzing those spiritual disciplines with you next Thursday.